Hello everybody and welcome to another Word for Word Bible comic video. In this one I'm looking at the harmonising the Gospels in regards to the events that happen around Jericho, particularly the healing of the blind man or men and where it happened and when. So when you read these accounts, they're on a surface reading there seems to be an irreconcilable contradiction. So what we're going to look at is the fact that when it comes to the healing of the blind man, both Mark in Mark 10:46 and Matthew, starting from Matthew 20:29, talk about when Jesus comes to Jericho. So it's he came to Jericho, but it's when he leaves Jericho that he heals blind Bartimaeus. So in Mark it says, "Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples together with the large crowd were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, that was the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, 'Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me.'" Matthew, in this little bit, Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho. A large crowd followed him. Two men were sitting by the roadside, and when they heard that Jesus was going by, they shouted, "Lord, son of David, have mercy on us." But Luke says, as Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what's happening. They told him, "Jesus of Nazareth is passing by." And he called out, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." So in Luke's account, which is Luke 18:35 onwards, he's approaching Jericho when he meets the blind man. In the others, it says he's going out. So people look at this and they say, it's a contradiction. The Bible is not inerrant and stuff like that. That's why it becomes a big deal. Now, in drawing the comic, I need to make sure that all these things are ironed out. I need to figure out what time of day it is, where they are, because I'm going to draw the people, and how the events are all linked together. Now, in Luke's account, he heals the blind man, and then after that it's the event with Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who hides in the tree, and Jesus calls him down. And then critically, the thing that makes the difference to the story is he then stays at his house, sort of overnight, and so he goes into Jericho, meets this guy and stays in his house. The other accounts, Matthew and Mark, don't have that event, but he is leaving Jericho when he meets the blind man. So how do we get these things to go together? For the past few hours or so, I've been reading through the accounts, and then also lots of commentaries on it, and there's several different ways that people try and resolve it. Now I'm going to try and break that down into kind of two broad categories, basically. Okay, so the reason I brought up the white screen is because I thought I might try and sort of draw it. Now, where's my little piece of paper? One of the key theories is that there's two Jerichos, effectively. There's an old city, and there's the new city. And so the new city is where Herod has built his palace, and the sort of surrounding buildings that have come up around that, and it's actually by the Wadi Kelt, which is the way to Jerusalem. And the old city has where Joshua defeated the the Canaanites, that sort of thing. And it's the main city there. So this is the kind of situation at the time. And so what people have said, of course, is that he's come along because he's just crossed over from the Perea, from the other side of the Jordan, and they've had lots of preaching and stuff, and then he's come up, and then he's gone to Jericho, stayed the night, and then the next day, when he's leaving, Mark and Matthew says as he's leaving, he meets a blind man. Now, in this scenario, the encounter with Zacchaeus, who's up the tree, would happen before, because Jesus is coming into the town. Zacchaeus is hiding in the tree, and Jesus says, "Hey, come down. I need to stay with you." And then they go into Jericho, stay in Jericho the night, and then, as Mark and Matthew have it, they leave town and they meet blind Bartimaeus. This harmonises with Luke, as you can see, because as they approach Jericho, so it would be the new city, they meet blind Bartimaeus. So you'd think that's great, that's solved the mystery. It particularly is more useful maybe because in the new city, that's the place which I think the Romans would consider Jericho, and the old city is kind of where everybody else, the Israelites and everybody would kind of consider to be the place. But maybe the reason the Romans might consider this to be is because they're allies of Herod, and it's been built for them, and it involves Antony and Cleopatra fame and stuff like that. So they might be like, this is Jericho. And the reason why do I say that? Because Luke is writing to an audience which isn't primarily Jewish, as Matthew is, but and Mark is Jewish as well, but some believe that Luke's account, aside from being made by Luke later on, is possibly for the purpose of the defence of Paul in the trial in Rome. So it's written for Romans. There's lots of occasions in Luke where they stress how good the centurions were, and the faith of the centurions, and what the Romans were doing, and that sort of thing. So in theory is that that Romans might consider this to be Jericho, and therefore he's saying, as they're approaching Jericho, they met him. So that could be the case. The other thing is that old Jericho, as I've drawn it, is they could have quite easily passed through there, because New Jericho is right at the entrance of the Wadi Kalt, where you walk up to get to Jerusalem. So it's possible that knowing the area, that would be the way that you would interpret it. The only problem with this theory is that in the Luke account, the encounter with Zacchaeus up the tree is written after this encounter with blind Bartimaeus. So in Luke's account, if you just only have Luke's account, it would say they met blind Bartimaeus, healed him, then they met Zacchaeus, then they stayed the night in Jericho. Now that would mean that we'd want to let me get the right colour. Place the encounter with Zacchaeus after the encounter with the blind man, and it would therefore be over this side. So the whole thing would mean that the encounter, Jesus goes through the old city, encounters this guy, the blind man, then encounters Zacchaeus, and then stays in New Jericho. Now, it's possible that, considering this, this is where the palace and stuff is, you might think, well, that would they stay in that area? But in theory, Zacchaeus is a what do they call them? Publican. So he works for the Romans. So in theory, he's super rich, because he takes taxes and he says he defrauds people. He might have a nice house in the new bit. So that is an option. Now so that's like one theory. Okay, that's one set of harmonization, that basically the two Jerichos. Now, if you don't buy that, there's another potential option. Okay, and that is that there is one Jericho. It's just Jericho, and that's it. And as we kind of already discussed, Jesus approaches. First, he meets the Zacchaeus. Oh, I have to explain this. Okay, in this scenario, you take the more information that we have, that he heals the blind man on the way out of Jericho and onto Jerusalem. That's the way that it just comes across in Matthew and Mark. Now, the Zacchaeus of the tree is something that happens before he stays in Jericho. So if there's only one Jericho, he stays there the night, and it's when he leaves that he heals the blind man. Now, this would mean that Luke's one would sound wrong. Like, as we read it, it says, as Jesus approached Jericho, the blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, it was happening. So, where was I? So he meets Zacchaeus, goes to Jericho, stays the night with Zacchaeus, and then as he's leaving, this happens. It would seem, we were reading, weren't we, from Luke, that it seems as though that would contradict Luke. Now, there's a couple of options here as well. I noticed that in Luke 18:35, it says, as Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. Full stop. When he heard the crowd. Now, so it could be that he was sitting as Jesus approached. So Jesus over there, and then he is sitting out begging, and he hears the crowd when they walk out the other side. So, it doesn't actually say, so it could be. And it also, I was looking at the Greek, and I'm not very good with the Greek, but I was looking at the translations and the words used, and it did give an option where it would just say, as Jesus was near Jericho, which again would potentially give the option that he was just on the other side. So the thing with this is that it seems fine in a way, that he meets Zacchaeus, he stays the night, he's near Jericho when he meets blind Bartimaeus, and and the statements are that when Jesus approached, he was begging, and when he heard him go by, which could have been in the morning, he cried out, or asked, who's that? And then he cried out. So that could be the case, but the real problem there is the encounter with Zacchaeus is in chapter 19, verse 1, and this bit is in Luke 18. So as it's set out, it's not my alarm, sorry. As it's set out, the it would, that would mean that this event, even though it's presented after this event, it was wrong. And in that case, that would mean that Luke's account was not in the right order. And that actually seems sort of like a real, like, it seems like you might think, oh, that's unlikely, that this event, which only happens in Luke, has been put in not in the right place. Why can't it just be in the right place after he heals the blind man? Which on our previous one, it would kind of work. But in other parts of the harmonisation of the Gospels that I've been working on, it doesn't seem like Luke is trying to put the events in order. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying he's putting them out of order and then making them seem like they are in order. But what he does, he gives little tiny short stories in a row, and they're not necessarily connected, because it tells us. So with this example, it gives all the information about he heals the blind man, and then it goes on to the next bit with Zacchaeus, and it says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. And what I'm suggesting is that it just starts a new little short story thing, like it's a load of separate events, because that's how it happened when Jesus calls the apostles and they're fishing and all that, and they go to Simon Peter's house with the mother-in-law. It turns out that the more you drill down into that the events are in the different order in Luke. And speaking to Christopher R. Smith, the guy who's helping me with the scholarship on this, Luke doesn't try and make it in order. He wants he gets all his events, but he set them out in, broadly speaking, as a miracle, then a lesson, then a miracle, then a lesson. So it's either a sermon. So lessons like either a sermon, or in this case, Zacchaeus repents. He gives the money, and there's all that lesson there. So the lesson with Zacchaeus comes after. So it's based on how he's writing his narrative. So he's got all these little tiny short stories. He doesn't say explicitly, then this happened. He says, when they're in Jericho, this happened. When they went to the synagogue, this happened. When they were in Capernaum, this happened. And they are roughly in order, but he's setting it out in much more of a deliberate way. So this could be the other option. So the point being, this one that you're looking at now is, if Luke is not writing in chronological order, because he's taking these short stories and putting them in the order that are roughly chronological but that suit the way he's writing his narrative, then this would be what happened. He met Zacchaeus, he went into the Jericho. There's only one Jericho in this scenario. He stays there the night. In the morning, he sets off with the big crowd. He meets the blind man. He heals him. And just to recap, in this scenario, you would say that Luke is writing chronologically, but because there are two sort of parts of Jericho, Jesus approaches Jericho as it's kind of getting nighttime. He goes through the old city. He comes out of the old city, meets blind Bartimaeus as he's coming out with the big crowd. He says, "Who's there?" Jesus heals him. Then he meets Zacchaeus as he's coming to the new Jericho. "Come down, I need to stay with you." He then goes into New Jericho to Zacchaeus' fancy house, and he stays there. So those are the two kind of, broadly speaking, the scenarios that that people seem to be able to work out. Of course, if you just think, as some say, the slight discrepancies prove that there wasn't collusion and different people wrote the Gospels as best they could based on their memories, and in Luke's case, not his memories, but other people's accounts, like a lawyer or a person constructing history from the local people, then obviously you need to worry about this. But those are the two kind of options I've worked out, and now I've just got to figure out which one I believe has the most validation, and put that into the comic. So I really hope you've enjoyed this little video. I hope I've made it nice and clear for you what I've been talking about, and if I have, great, give us a like. If you've got questions, comments, please put a comment down. I'd love to answer, talk about it. I'll put some links below to the passages, and you can read them for yourself. Have a look. Give me your opinion so that I can use those to inform my own choices and study. Thanks very much for watching.